They refused to pay me $50,000. So I exposed their $300 million fraud and made $45 million instead. Look, I'm not the kind of guy who believes in karma or cosmic justice or any of that stuff. I'm a systems guy. I deal in logic, in patterns, in the cold, hard reality of ones and zeros. But what happened to me last year made me wonder if maybe the universe does keep its own ledger after all. My name is David McCarthy. I'm 49 years old, and for the last 23 years, I've been what you might call a digital archaeologist. When companies need someone to dig through their ancient IT systems, the ones built back when floppy disks were actually floppy, they call me. I'm the guy who speaks languages that died before Google was born. The day it all started, I was sitting in my home office doing what I do best, restoring order to chaos. In front of me on my workbench sat the disassembled guts of a 1960s Swiss watch. Every tiny gear, every spring, every jewel bearing laid out in perfect rows on white cloth. This is how I meditate. Some people do yoga. I take apart mechanical things and put them back together. There's this quote from Leonardo da Vinci I keep taped to my monitor. Details make perfection, and perfection is not a detail. That's not just some artsy saying to me. That's a way of life. In my world, one missing semicolon can crash an entire system. One misaligned gear can stop time itself. The phone rang. I knew who it was before I looked at the screen. My ex-wife Jen has a specific ringtone. Not because I'm sentimental, but because I'm organized. She got straight to the point like she always does. The dorm deposit for our daughter Emma had come due. Spring semester at Boston University doesn't pay for itself. Did I remember? Of course I remembered. I remember every invoice, every due date, every decimal point of my financial obligations. My marriage might have fallen apart, but my spreadsheets never lie. I told her the money would be there. I just landed a big contract. Well, big in the financial sense. In every other sense, it sounded like a nightmare. Some wealthy family needed someone to dig through their legacy systems and make the data disappear. Corporate digital cremation, basically. She asked if I was okay with that kind of work. There was this pause on the line, this old familiar tiredness we'd both developed over the years. Not anger anymore, just exhaustion. I told her I was fine with it. In this economy, you don't turn down $50,000 just because the clients might be unpleasant. Besides, I've dealt with unpleasant before. Unpleasant is just another variable to account for. What I didn't tell her was that I'd been living on ramen and hope for the past 2 months. That my last 3 contracts had fallen through. That the tech world had decided guys like me were obsolete, just like the systems we specialized in. The Warner estate sat in the kind of neighborhood where the driveways are longer than most people's streets. Old money, the type that builds walls and calls them privacy. As I pulled up in my 15-year-old Honda Civic, I felt like I was driving a shopping cart into a Lamborghini dealership. The house itself was massive, but something about it felt wrong. Too many angles. Too much glass. Like an architect had been given unlimited money, but zero taste. It screamed wealth the way a new tattoo screams for attention. Loud and trying way too hard. A guy who could only be Julian Warner met me at the door. Mid-30s, expensive suit with no tie, the kind of casual that costs more than formal. He looked at me the way you look at a plumber who showed up to fix your toilet. Necessary, but beneath acknowledgement. He didn't shake my hand. Instead, he launched into this speech about legacy system sunset specialists and decommissioning dinosaurs and moving to cloud solutions. Every sentence was corporate buzzword bingo. He called the old server equipment legacy infrastructure, like he was trying to make garbage sound sophisticated. The funny thing about rich people is they think fancy words make them sound smart. But when you've been in IT as long as I have, you learn that complicated language usually hides simple contempt. He wasn't explaining the job. He was explaining that I was beneath him. He kept using this phrase, sunset specialist, like I was some kind of poet of obsolescence. In reality, I was just a janitor for their digital skeletons. My job was to make sure their sunset was quiet and permanent, as he put it. Then he walked me down to the basement, and that's where I met Prometheus. The server room was everything you'd expect. Cold, sterile, fluorescent lights humming like dying insects, rows of modern equipment blinking their little LED heartbeats. But in the corner, covered in a fine layer of dust, sat something that belonged in a museum. The Prometheus server. Beige metal casing. Must have weighed 300 pounds. It hummed like an old diesel engine, this deep mechanical growl that you could feel in your chest. On the front panel was a faded logo for Logo Systems, a company that went bankrupt before I graduated high school. This thing was running on something called LCOM. That's not even an operating system most people have heard of. The last programmer who understood this language probably died before smartphones existed. Julian stood there with his arms crossed, looking at this machine like it was a rotting corpse in his basement, which, in a way, it was. He told me they needed everything on it gone. Not archived, not transferred, gone, like it never existed. They'd hired me because my resume said digital archaeologist, and apparently that sounded exotic enough for their purposes. I walked up to Prometheus and put my hand on the metal casing. It was warm, vibrating, still alive after all these decades. There's something almost sacred about that. This machine had been faithfully processing data since before the internet, and now its reward was obliteration. I explained to Julian that you can't just delete this kind of system. There are laws, SOX compliance, Sarbanes-Oxley, regulations that exist specifically because rich people try to make their financial crimes disappear by destroying records. I told him I'd create an encrypted, unreadable archive that would satisfy the legal requirements, then physically destroy the hardware. He actually laughed, called me cute, said I was adorable with all my talk about laws and requirements. He told me to do my paperwork, create my archives, make myself feel better about the process. But the bottom line was simple: make it disappear. That's when I should have walked away. That's when every instinct I had was screaming at me that something was wrong. But Emma's tuition was due. My landlord wasn't accepting good intentions as rent. So I nodded and got to work. The next 3 weeks were like living in a tomb. I'd arrive at 8 in the morning, descend into that freezing basement, and sit in front of Prometheus while the world continued above my head. I could hear them up there. Parties, laughter, the clink of expensive glasses, music that probably cost more per song than I made per hour. Nobody came to check on me. Nobody asked if I needed anything. I was invisible, just another piece of equipment in the basement, slightly more mobile than the server I was working on. The isolation wasn't the worst part. I've always been fine with solitude. It was a casual dismissal. The way Julian would occasionally pass by the server room door, glance in, and keep walking like I was furniture. One afternoon, his kid wandered down, maybe 10 years old, bored out his mind in that massive house. He poked his head into the server room and asked if I was fixing the lights. I told him something like that. Said I was making sure old shadows didn't come back. The kid looked at me like I'd spoken in tongues and ran back upstairs. I heard him yelling something about a weird guy in the basement. That moment stuck with me. To this family, I wasn't even real enough to warrant a proper introduction. Just the weird guy in the basement, the sunset specialist, the digital janitor. The thing about being treated like you're invisible is that it's not dramatic. There's no big confrontation, no shouting match. It's just layer after layer of small dismissals. Death by 1,000 paper cuts of contempt. But here's what they didn't understand about guys like me. We notice details. We see patterns. We remember. And Prometheus was starting to whisper secrets. As I dug deeper into the system, running diagnostics and preparing the archival protocols, I noticed something odd. The file structure was too complex, too layered. You don't build a system this elaborate just to track normal business operations. I'd been hired to perform a digital cremation, but I was starting to wonder what exactly they wanted cremated. In my world, you account for every variable. You don't leave an open port, you don't grant unnecessary permissions, and you never, ever leave a legacy system with unknown capabilities just sitting there. Prometheus wasn't just an old server. It was a root-level vulnerability they'd ignored for decades, and they just handed the admin password to a stranger. I spent those weeks in that basement cataloging everything, creating documentation, building my archive, being thorough, being professional, doing exactly what they'd hire me to do. But I was also curious. You don't survive 23 years in this business without developing an instinct for when something doesn't add up. And every layer I peeled back revealed more complexity, more encryption, more sophistication than any legitimate business system would need. Late one night, sitting alone in that cold basement with only the hum of Prometheus for company, I had this realization. This machine had been running continuously for decades, faithfully processing transactions, maintaining records, keeping secrets. It was a time capsule, a witness to everything the Warner family had done since before I was born, and now they wanted it silenced. I thought about my daughter, about how she'd worked so hard to get into BU, about how she'd call me crying with joy when the acceptance letter came, about how she'd immediately started doing the math on costs and looked up scholarship opportunities because she knew money was tight. I thought about my ex-wife and how we promised Emma we'd figure it out, how we'd give her the opportunities we never had. And then I thought about Julian Warner and his careless wealth, his casual cruelty, the way he'd call me cute for mentioning laws. I thought about Julian Warner calling me cute for mentioning the law, and I looked at the humming machine in front of me, a machine whose secrets were slowly revealing themselves only to me. Arthur C. Clarke once wrote that advanced technology is like magic. He was right. And in that cold basement, I realized that the Warners had no idea what kind of magic they just put into my hands. The final week of the contract arrived. I completed the archival process, created the encrypted backups, prepared everything according to proper protocol. My documentation was immaculate, every step logged, every decision justified. I was ready to present my work and collect my final payment, $20,000, enough to cover Emma's deposit and buy myself a few months of breathing room. Prometheus sat in its corner, humming its ancient song, all its secrets locked away behind algorithms I'd personally designed. I held the only key to that archive. Not that it mattered much to them. They just wanted it gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I'd been in enough corporate basements to know what normal data deletion looks like. This wasn't normal. This was panic dressed up as efficiency. And panic, in my experience, always leave a trail. I just needed to find the first breadcrumb. The breadcrumb showed up 3 days before I was scheduled to finish the job. I was running final verification protocols on Prometheus, the kind of tedious quality assurance work that makes most IT guys want to gouge their eyes out. But I've always found comfort in checking and double-checking. Numbers don't lie. Systems don't have hidden agendas. They just are, until they aren't. The diagnostic program I'd written was pretty straightforward. It calculated the total storage space used on the server and compared it to the sum of all known files and directories. Basic accounting, digital addition, the kind of thing that should always balance to zero, except it didn't. The numbers were off by 15%. 15% of 3 terabytes is about 450 gigabytes. That's not a rounding error. That's not a glitch. That's an entire hidden library of data that shouldn't exist. I sat there staring at my screen, that familiar itch crawling up the back of my neck. The same feeling you get when you're doing a jigsaw puzzle and find a piece that doesn't belong to the box you're working on. Something was wrong with the fundamental architecture of reality here. In a lock system, the math should be perfect. Storage use should equal files present. Always. It's like opening a sealed room and discovering an extra person standing in the corner. Impossible, but undeniably there. I ran the diagnostic again. Same result. Then I ran a third time using a different method, pulling data directly from the hardware controllers. Same discrepancy. 15% ghost data. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I drank it anyway. The basement was freezing as always, but I barely noticed. This was the kind of problem that made me forget about physical discomfort. This was a puzzle that shouldn't exist. Systems don't lie, but the people who build them absolutely do. I should mention something about how my brain works. Most people see code as this abstract thing, ones and zeros floating in digital space. but I see it as architecture, as rooms and corridors and hidden passages. Every system is a building, and every building has its secrets if you know where to look. Prometheus was a very old building, and old buildings always have spaces between the walls. I spent the next 6 hours going deeper than I'd ever intended to go. This wasn't part of the job anymore. This was pure professional curiosity, mixed with a growing sense that I'd stumbled onto something the Warners very much did not want found. The deeper I dug into the low-level code, the more sophisticated the architecture became. This was an amateur hour. Whoever built this hidden system knew exactly what they were doing. They'd create a parallel structure that mimicked legitimate system files, camouflaged so well that normal diagnostics would skip right over it. Around 2 in the morning, I found it, a subdirectory masked as a system recovery partition. The kind of thing that looks so boring and technical that even other IT professionals would ignore it. But when I examined the actual file structure, I realized it wasn't a recovery partition at all. It was a complete parallel accounting system. The directory was labeled Hades. Not exactly subtle, but then again, they probably never expected anyone to find it. Of course, it was password protected, triple encrypted with algorithms that would have been considered cutting edge in the 1980s, which meant they were laughably outdated now, but still tedious to crack. I tried the obvious combinations first. Warner, Julian, dates of birth I could find in public records, the name of their company. Nothing worked. Then I started thinking like an engineer from the 80s. These guys had grown up in a different era. They read different books. They had different references. I tried Midas. Nothing. Croesus. Nothing. Prometheus itself. Nothing. Then, almost as a joke, I tried Icarus. The system unlocked. The irony wasn't lost on me. Icarus, who flew too close to the sun on wings his father built, who fell to his death because he got too ambitious, too careless. Someone in the Warner family had a sense of humor, or maybe they just appreciated Greek tragedy. What opened in front of me was the most beautiful piece of financial crime I'd ever seen. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't looking for this. I wasn't some crusading hero trying to expose corruption. I was just an IT guy who found a mathematical impossibility and couldn't let it go. But now that I was looking at it, I couldn't look away. The Hades system was a complete shadow ledger. Parallel books that track money the IRS would never see. It wasn't just 1 or 2 shady transactions. This was an ecosystem, a complete alternate financial reality that had been running continuously since before I was born. I saw transactions dated from the year I graduated high school, from the year I got married, from the year Emma was born. Decades of careful, systematic fraud, preserved in perfect digital amber. The sophistication was actually impressive from a technical standpoint. Money would come into the legitimate business, get recorded in the normal books, then a portion would get siphoned off into Hades through a series of fake vendor payments and consulting fees. Once in the shadow system, it would get laundered through shell companies and offshore accounts with names like Titan Holdings and Olympus Ventures. Whoever designed this understood both technology and accounting. They created a machine that turned taxable income into invisible wealth, running 24/7 for longer than I'd been in the industry. I spent hours just reading through it, taking notes, starting to understand the full scope. The amounts were staggering. Individual transactions in the millions. Annual totals that made my head spin. When I finally ran a comprehensive analysis, the total came to just over $300 million. $300 million that the federal government didn't know existed. And in that moment, sitting in that freezing basement at 4 in the morning, I thought about my daughter. I thought about Emma doing scholarship math before she'd even celebrated her acceptance letter. I thought about the worry in her voice when she asked if we could afford it. I thought about eating ramen so I could make my half of her tuition payments while Julian Warner threw parties above my head. $300 million. That number kept echoing in my head. That was 10,000 college educations. That was the GDP of a small country. That was more money than everyone I'd ever known would earn in their entire lives, combined. And the Warners had stolen it, not through violence or threats, just through patience and a really good piece of code. This wasn't abstract anymore. This wasn't just interesting puzzle. This was personal. But I'm a professional. So I documented everything methodically. I took encrypted screenshots. I created a complete map of the system architecture. I wrote detailed notes explaining how the fraud worked, how long it had been running, where the money went. By the time the sun came up, I had created the most comprehensive evidence package of financial crime you could imagine. And I hadn't even finished the original job yet. I wrapped up the legitimate archival work over the next 2 days, created the encrypted backup, like I was supposed to, prepared the documentation for the hardware destruction, did everything by the book. The whole time, I kept thinking about Hades, about whether I should say something, about what would happen if I did, about what would happen if I didn't. Mostly, I thought about that $20,000 I needed for Emma's deposit. On my last day, I sent Julian an email letting him know the work was complete and requesting a final walkthrough. He responded within minutes, telling me to come up to his father's study. The whole family wanted to be there for the handoff. That should have been my second warning sign. When rich people want witnesses, they're planning something. The study was exactly what you'd expect. Dark wood paneling. Leather chairs that probably cost more than my car. Degrees from expensive universities framed on the walls. Old Mr. Warner sat behind a desk the size of my kitchen table, with Julian standing beside him like some kind of corporate prince in waiting. Julian's wife was there too, looking bored and scrolling through her phone. Another older guy I didn't recognize, probably their lawyer, sat in the corner with a briefcase. I laid out my documentation, showed them the encrypted archive, explained the compliance measures I'd implemented. Professional, thorough, exactly what they'd paid for. Julian barely glanced at the paperwork. Instead, he exchanged a look with his father, the kind of look that said they'd already decided how this was going to go. Then he told me they'd reviewed my contract, said I'd taken longer than expected, said they'd decided to withhold the final payment of $50,000, called it a penalty for inefficiency. $50,000. I'd been expecting 20. Apparently, they decided to restructure our agreement without telling me. I kept my voice calm, told him the delay was due to the unexpected complexity of their own system, reminded him that I documented every hour, every decision, every complication. I had timestamps, logs, detailed notes, everything you'd need to justify the timeline. Julian smiled. It was the kind of smile that told me he didn't care about documentation or justification, or any of the things that mattered in my world. That's when he said it. Said their lawyers had assured them that the statute of limitations on those old transactions had expired decades ago. Back in the 80s, he said, waving his hand like he was dismissing ancient history. He called it digital dust. Said it had no legal weight whatsoever. My complexity, he said, was just digging through garbage, and they didn't pay premiums for garbage collection. Then he leaned back in his chair and really twisted the knife. Said those $50,000 weren't for the work anyway. Said it was payment for my silence. But since I seemed like the quiet type already, maybe they were just being generous by not demanding I pay them for wasting their time. The lawyer in the corner smirked. Julian's wife didn't even look up from her phone. Old Mr. Warner just stared at me with dead eyes, like I was a minor accounting discrepancy that had been efficiently resolved. I stood there for a long moment, looking at these people, really seeing them for the first time. They weren't just rich. They weren't just arrogant. They were fundamentally convinced that people like me didn't matter, that rules didn't apply to them, that they could steal $300 million, stiff the guy who found it, and face zero consequences. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they were smart. They were wrong on both counts. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't threaten or bluster or do any of the things desperate people do when they're getting screwed. I just nodded slowly, gathered my documentation, and started packing up my equipment. Julian called security to escort me out, like I was some kind of threat that needed managing. 2 guys in badly fitting suits walked me to my car, watched me load my laptop and tool bag, made sure I left the property. The whole time, I kept my face blank. No emotion, no reaction, Just a tired, middle-aged IT guy who'd gotten stiffed on a contract and knew better than to fight people with expensive lawyers. But in my pocket, I had a thumb drive. A tiny piece of plastic and silicon, smaller than my thumb, containing a custom encryption key I'd written specifically for Prometheus Archive. Without that key, the backup I created was just random noise. Millions of lines of meaningless data that would take quantum computers centuries to decrypt. With the key, it was a perfect record of everything on that server, including Hades. The Warners thought they'd won, thought they'd saved $50,000 and ensured my silence, thought the old server would be destroyed, the archive locked away forever, and their secret safe for another generation. What they didn't know was that I held the only key in existence to their family's entire criminal history. And I just decided exactly what I was going to do with it. I drove home in silence. No music, no phone calls, just the sound of my ancient Civic's engine and my own breathing. My hands were steady on the wheel. My heartbeat was normal. I probably looked like any other exhausted contractor driving home after a bad day. But inside, something had crystallized, hardened, locked into place like a puzzle piece finding its slot. The Warners had made a critical error. They'd assumed that because something happened a long time ago, it didn't matter anymore. They confused the statute of limitations with immunity. They trusted their lawyers more than they'd understood the law. But the real mistake went deeper than flawed legal advice. It wasn't about the $50,000. They'd dismissed me. They'd looked at the quiet guy in the basement and seen nothing more than a tool to be discarded. They'd insulted my intelligence. That simple fact was going to cost them everything. I pulled into my apartment parking lot as the sun was setting, sat in my car for a minute, watching the light fade, feeling the weight of that thumb drive in my pocket. I thought about Emma, about Jen, about 23 years of being professional and playing by the rules and watching wealthy people treat the world like their personal playground. And I thought about something my first programming instructor told me back in college. He said that revenge was like programming. If you're going to do it right. Plan every step. Account for every variable. Test your logic. And when you finally execute, make sure there's no undo button. I sat there in my car, thumb drive in my pocket, and started planning the most carefully executed code I'd ever written. The code that would bring down a dynasty. When I finally went inside, I walked past my desk without turning on the lights, went straight to the kitchen, made a fresh pot of coffee, and stood at the window looking out at nothing. The Warners thought they'd seen the last of me, thought I'd slink away and forget about them, thought their money and lawyers and arrogance made them immune to consequences. They had no idea that the ghost in their machine was about to become very, very real, and that this ghost had perfect documentation. The first thing I did when I got home was finish the watch. I know that sounds crazy. I just discovered a $300 million fraud and walked away from the biggest insult of my professional life. And my first priority was completing a restoration project on a 60-year-old timepiece. But that's how my brain works. Before you can fix the big problems, you need to prove to yourself that you can still fix the small ones. Every gear, every spring, every tiny jewel bearing. I assembled them in perfect sequence, working by the light of my desk lamp until 3 a.m. When I finally wound the mainspring and heard that first tick, that perfect mechanical heartbeat, something settled inside me. Order could be restored. Chaos could be defeated. You just needed patience and precision. Only then did I open my laptop. The IRS whistleblower office has this beautifully bureaucratic website. Very official, very serious. Lots of legal disclaimers and process flowcharts. But buried in all that government speak was the most beautiful sentence I'd ever read. Whistleblowers may receive between 15 and 30% of collected proceeds. I sat there staring at that sentence for a solid 5 minutes, doing the math. $300 million at 15%. $45 million. I actually laughed out loud. My neighbors probably thought I'd lost my mind. The thing about whistleblower rewards that most people don't understand is that they're not charity. They're not the government being generous. They're a bounty system. The IRS is basically saying, if you can hand us a case so airtight that we can collect hundreds of millions in stolen tax revenue, will cut you in on the take. It's the most capitalist approach to justice I've ever seen, and I loved every mercenary inch of it. But I'm not stupid. You don't just email the IRS with evidence of massive fraud and hope for the best. You need a lawyer, a really good lawyer who specializes in whistleblower cases, the kind that costs $500 an hour and earns every penny. I found one in Boston, former federal prosecutor, 20 years of experience, the kind of resume that makes you feel broke just reading it. I called his office at 9 a.m. the next morning. When I explained what I had, there was this long pause on the phone. Then he asked me to repeat the amount. When I did, he cleared his afternoon schedule. We met in his office 2 days later. I brought my laptop, my documentation, and the encryption key on that tiny thumb drive. Spread it all out on his conference table, like I was showing him plans for a heist. He spent 3 hours going through everything. Didn't say much, just occasionally made notes or asked clarifying questions. Very methodical, very thorough. I liked him immediately. When he finally leaned back in his chair, he looked at me with something between respect and disbelief. He told me this was the most professionally documented case of financial fraud he'd seen in his entire career. Said most whistleblowers come in with suspicions and fragments. I'd brought him a complete prosecution roadmap. Then he quoted me his fee structure. 20% of any award I received. Completely standard for whistleblower cases. I didn't even blink. 20% of $45 million was still more money than I'd see in 10 lifetimes. We spent the next week preparing the submission. He had me write a technical report explaining exactly how the Hades system worked. Not just what crimes were committed, but the architecture of how they were committed, the engineering behind the fraud. I called it the user manual for the Hades system, and I wrote it like I was teaching a class. Section 1. Introduction to Legacy Greed. A complete technical breakdown of the Prometheus server, its capabilities, its age, why it had survived so long. I even included photos of the hardware with annotations. Section 2. The key to Pandora's box. Step-by-step instructions for accessing the encrypted archive using the key I created. Written so clearly that a competent IT forensic analyst could follow along like it was an IKEA manual. Section 3. Anatomy of a crime. This was my masterpiece. A complete analysis of every transaction in the shadow ledger. Where the money came from, where it went, how the shell companies connected. Visual flowcharts showing the laundering ecosystem. I even added footnotes. Professional, academic, slightly sarcastic. One of them read, "This scheme demonstrates such elegant simplicity in its execution that it deserves study in business schools, specifically in their criminal law departments." My lawyer loved that line. Said it showed I understood exactly what I was looking at and had the confidence to call it what it was. The whole document was 247 pages, single-spaced, with appendices. It was less a whistleblower report and more a doctoral thesis on financial crime. My lawyer said it was perfect, said the IRS would take one look at this and fast-track the investigation, said cases as well documented almost never failed to result in prosecution. I asked him how long it usually took. He said anywhere from 6 months to 3 years, depending on complexity. I told him I'd wait as long as it took. We filed the report in March, anonymously as the law allows. The IRS confirmed receipt within 48 hours. Then silence. Complete radio silence. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Nothing. No updates. No questions. No indication that anyone was even reading what I'd sent. I started checking the news obsessively, looking for any mention of the Warners, any hint that an investigation was underway. Nothing. In June, I saw Julian Warner on the local news at some charity gala, smiling, shaking hands, giving a speech about community values. I threw my remote at the TV. My lawyer kept telling me to be patient. Said federal investigations move slowly. Said the better the case, the longer they take because they're building something airtight. Every time he said that, I wanted to believe him a little less. By August, I was starting to panic. Not because I care about the money anymore, Well, not just because of the money. It was the silence, the complete absence of any indication that justice was happening. What if the statute of limitations really had expired? What if the Warners' lawyers were right? What if I'd burned my bridges, risked everything, and accomplished nothing except making myself feel clever? Then Emma called. It was a Tuesday evening in September. 8 months since I'd filed a report. She was so excited she could barely get the words out. She'd been selected for a summer research internship at MIT. Full funding. Incredible opportunity. Career-making stuff for a sophomore. But there was a deposit, $2,000, due by Friday to hold her spot. She was trying so hard to sound casual about it. Kept saying she understood if it wasn't possible right now. Said she could apply again next year. But I could hear it in her voice. That little crack. That disappointment she was trying to hide. I looked at my bank account. I could cover it. Barely. It would drain my emergency fund down to nothing. Leave me vulnerable if anything went wrong. But it was possible. I told her not to worry. Told her the deposit would be there by Thursday. Told her to start planning because she was absolutely going to MIT. When I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time. Just sat there in the dark, looking at the photo of Emma on my desk. The one from her high school graduation. So proud. So hopeful. So completely trusting that her dad would somehow make it all work. And I thought, what if I was wrong? What if this perfect plan was just pride in disguise? What if I'd sacrificed financial security for the satisfaction of being right? I transferred the $2,000 to Emma the next morning. Watched my savings account drop to a number that made my stomach hurt. Then I sat at my desk and stared at that restored watch, ticking away perfectly. All those tiny pieces working together. All that precision and order. All that effort to make something beautiful function the way it was supposed to. Had I just done the same thing with my life? Or had I taken it apart and forgotten how to put it back together? The doubt was worse than the waiting. The doubt made me question everything. My judgment, my intelligence, my understanding of how the world actually worked. Maybe the Warners were right. Maybe people like them really did live by different rules. Maybe justice was just a fairy tale we told ourselves to feel better about systematic unfairness. I didn't sleep well that night. Or the next. 14 months after I filed a report on a Tuesday morning in May, I was drinking coffee and scrolling through news on my phone. Same routine I'd followed every morning for over a year. Expecting nothing. Finding nothing. Then the alert popped up. Breaking news. Federal agents executing search warrants at the Warner estate. Tax fraud investigation. Possible charges pending. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Then I clicked through to the live coverage. And there it was. The Warner Mansion. Federal vehicles parked across that perfect lawn. Agents in windbreakers carrying boxes of documents out the front door. And Julian Warner in handcuffs. Silk pajamas. No shoes. Looking absolutely bewildered as they walked him to an unmarked car. He was shouting something about a mistake. About his lawyers. About how this was impossible. I took another sip of coffee. Watched him get loaded into that car. Watched his father and mother get let out next, also in cuffs. Watched their perfect world collapse in real time on live television. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. I just felt calm, like watching a complex algorithm finally execute correctly after months of debugging. This wasn't emotion. This was just results. The news coverage was incredible. Within hours, every major outlet was running the story. Billion-dollar family empire under investigation for massive tax fraud. Federal agents seizing records going back decades. Sources saying the case was based on an anonymous whistleblower report. One anchor called it the most detailed fraud case the IRS had seen in years. Said the whistleblower's documentation was so thorough that prosecutors were calling it a roadmap to conviction. I'd written that roadmap in my basement while eating cold pizza and drinking gas station coffee. Over the next few weeks, the dominoes kept falling. The family's assets were frozen. Their business empire started collapsing as partners and investors fled. Their lawyers tried every defense in the book. Julian even tried to blame me. Did an interview claiming the IT contractor they'd hired had fabricated evidence. Said I planted the data. Said I was trying to extort them. His lawyers probably told him that was a terrible idea, but rich people don't listen when they're desperate. The thing about accusing someone of fabricating decades-old data on a legacy system is that it requires you to admit the data exists. And once you admit it exists, you have to explain where it came from. Julian couldn't do both. His story fell apart within 48 hours. A former federal prosecutor went on CNN and called it an act of desperation by someone who knows they're caught. When I saw that, I smiled. Just slightly. Just for a second. The envelope arrived on a Thursday in July. Heavy paper. Official seal. Return address from the Department of the Treasury. I knew what was before I opened it. You don't get mail from Treasury unless it's very good news or very bad news. And I'd already filed my taxes. I sat at my desk for a full minute, just holding it, feeling the weight. Then I carefully opened it with my letter opener. Because even in moments like this, you do things properly. The letter was formal, official, exactly what you'd expect from a government agency handling serious financial matters. It thanked me for my cooperation in a matter of significant public interest. It detailed how my information had led to recovery of $301 million in unpaid taxes, penalties, and interest. And according to the whistleblower program guidelines, I was entitled to 15% of collected proceeds. The check was attached. I had to look at it 3 times to count all the zeros correctly. $45,150,000. I sat there for a long time, just looking at it. This piece of paper that represented more money than everyone I'd ever known would earn in their combined lifetimes. Payment for being thorough, for being right, for refusing to be dismissed. The restored watch sat next to me on the desk, ticking perfectly, every gear in its place, every spring doing exactly what it was designed to do. Order restored. My phone rang. Emma. She was calling about the internship, about how amazing it was, about the research she was doing. Then she paused. She said she'd been thinking about fall semester, about how expensive everything was, about whether she should maybe take a semester off, work, save some money. I looked at that check, looked at the watch, looked at the photo of her in her graduation cap. I told her she wasn't taking any semesters off, told her I'd just closed a major contract, told her focus on her research and stop worrying about money, told her to dream bigger, because her old man had finally gotten lucky. She asked how lucky. I told her lucky enough that she could stop doing scholarship math and start doing whatever kind of math actually interested her. She was quiet for a second. Then she asked how I'd managed it. What kind of contract pays that well? I looked at the watch again, at all those tiny pieces working in perfect harmony, at the precision and care required to make something complicated function beautifully. I told her I'd just done what I always do, took something complicated and broken, and put all the pieces back where they belonged. Turned out the universe keeps its own books, and it doesn't tolerate disorder forever. She laughed, said that was the most dad answer I'd ever given, said she loved me, said she had to get back to the lab, but she'd call this weekend. After she hung up, I sat there for a while longer, the check on my desk, the watch ticking beside it, the afternoon sun coming through my office window. I wasn't thinking about the money or even the Warners. I was thinking about Leonardo da Vinci. Details make perfection. They'd built an empire on ignoring the details, on assuming digital dust couldn't hurt them, on believing the quiet guy in the basement was just another tool to be discarded. They'd failed to understand that being underestimated is the ultimate strategic advantage, and that every system, no matter how powerful, has vulnerabilities. Sometimes that vulnerability is just a person who pays attention. I picked up the check, looked at it one more time. Then I carefully folded it and put it in my wallet. Tomorrow I deposit it, set up trusts, make plans, do all the responsible things you do when you suddenly have more money than you can spend. But today, I just sat in my office and listened to my watch tick. Perfect, steady, precise. The sound of order restored. My lawyer called that evening. He'd seen the news, wanted to congratulate me, wanted to talk about his fee. 20% of $45 million. I told him he'd earned every penny. He laughed, said he'd never doubted the case, but he'd never seen one move this fast or end this decisively. I told him that's what happens when you hand the government a case so airtight they'd have to be incompetent to lose it. When you make justice as simple as following instructions. He said I should write a book. I said I'd rather just fix watches. But I am telling you this story because the books always balance eventually. The universe keeps its own ledger, and it doesn't tolerate disorder forever. Sometimes it just takes a quiet guy in a basement to send the final invoice. I still work in IT, still dig through legacy systems, still speak dead languages and fix broken things. But I'm more selective about my clients now, and I charge a lot more per hour. The Warners taught me something valuable. They taught me that the statute of limitations on tax fraud is actually 6 years from when the IRS discovers a fraud, not from when it was committed. They taught me that whistleblower protections are real. They taught me that karma isn't mystical. It's just accounting. And the books always balance eventually. Emma finished her internship, got accepted into a graduate program, stopped worrying about money and started worrying about research and thesis deadlines and all the things students should worry about. Jen called me after the news broke. Figured out pretty quickly where the Warner whistleblower money went. Didn't say much. Just told me she was proud of me. That Emma was lucky to have me as a father. That might have meant more to me than the check. Might have. I still have that watch on my desk. Still ticking perfectly. Still reminding me every day that details matter. That precision counts. That order can be restored if you're patient enough. And I still have that thumb drive. The encryption key to 40 years of crime. It sits in my desk drawer, backed up in 3 separate secure locations, just in case anyone ever questions the documentation. Nobody has. The Warners took plea deals, paid their fines, accepted their sentences, disappeared from public life. The ghosts in their machine made sure their sunset was quiet and permanent, just like they asked.